and we are working on it, and you're live.
Okay. Okay, right, let's try that again. What's the TLDR of what I just said? Hi everybody, welcome. Really sorry that we're late. That was my fault. There was a tech fail from me, but let's make up with it with some cool stuff later. So welcome to the Romance in Science Fiction and Fantasy panel, which is I'm really excited to be doing. I have spent most of the last 2 weeks not doing very much of my job. If anybody is from my job, don't listen, and reading a whole load of stuff that everybody has written here. My name is Esther and I'll be the moderator this evening. My pronouns are she and her, and not only am I the chair of Glasgow in 2024, a Worldcon for Our Futures, but I am also, I've also written quite widely about romance and sex and gender and sexuality and how they all kind of combine in video games. So, and I'm a massive romance reader as well. So it's kind of, it's one of the things that I want to see more of at Worldcon, but you know, chair's right of way doesn't, you know, I have to be good. But I'm really delighted to introduce everybody this evening. And of course, you have the sort of wonderful experience of looking in everybody's rooms. If you just look over, this is where I start pointing and it's always embarrassing. But if you just look over at Rachel and you look behind her, you can see the cover of her most recent book is right behind her.
Oh yeah, my poster.
We might, yeah. In fact, it's complicated. So Rachel is in my bad books because she released a book 8 days ago. 8 days ago, which I haven't finished, but I have read all the other ones. So, yeah, it doesn't look particularly.
That's amazing! I can't believe you've read all of them.
So I haven't read
Esther.
the Lightning Conjurer series, but I've read the Inked series. And one of the things that I'll sort of talk about as we start talking is that there's been some really, really amazing parallels in the kind of writing that's been not just as romance, but there's all these weird connections. So last Wednesday, I was reading Becky James's book. I was reading The Tenets and the Tattoos. And the reason that I was reading that was because I was going to get inked. And I actually have a tattoo at the moment, which is really itchy.
Yeah.
It's got to that stage where it just looks gross and horrible. But it just kind of, there are all these sort of weird things, and there are all these places as well. It's weird in fantasy fiction when you're kind of moving in and out of the real world where things intersect. I hope we don't talk about Birmingham New Street Station too much.
Yes.
But yeah, it is.
Flashback.
Anyway, that was a slightly lengthy introduction. I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into it. So I'm going to take them from the order that I can see them in. So the first person is Liz Delton, and Liz has written both a series of kind of, I guess, one-shot books, and also the Realms of Camellia. Is that the right? Have I said it the right way?
Yep. Realm of Camellia.
Realm of Camellia series, which is, as with pretty much everybody else, a 4-part series. And the one that I've actually looked at was The Alchemist's Mirror, which is interesting because it was, I think we'll kind of talk about a couple of you are sort of love, but maybe not romance. And there's a little bit of romance, but there's a lot of love. And I think that's really, really interesting. So welcome, Liz. Then we've got Jen Edwards, who's written the Rain and Ruin series, which is, the Mages of the Wheel series, and Rain and Ruin is the first one. And again, the sort of parallel there is just the most amazing cover. It's absolutely beautiful. It's really unusual for a romance book as well. I really, really love the line art on it. Then we've got Becky James, who's written the King's Swordsman series, the first of which is The Tenets and the Tattoos, which has got some really, really interesting discussions of love, I think, and strong relationships. So I'm hoping we can talk about that later. And then finally, down on my left, bottom left, we have Rachel Rener, who's just released the 3rd part of the Gilded Blood series, with the 4th part being announced. Also, audiobooks just announced. Romance audiobooks are amazing. And has also written the Lightning Conjurer series. And for anybody who's interested in these, they're all available on Kindle Unlimited. But if you don't want to pay the mighty Amazon, money. They're all available for about £3 to £5. So go and spend 20 quid right now. Stop watching their panel. Okay. So I don't think it's super productive to talk about whether or not romance is a good thing to have in fantasy and science fiction literature, because it is. So there, good job. And I think we sort of out to bed. It's like boring panel question 101. Let's get that one out of the way. But what I do want to know from all of you is how you felt that a fantasy set, end of chat, says Robin Duncan. Lol. That's it. No more panel, just me. But how well do you think having a fantasy setting lends itself to having romance in it? Because I think that's a much more interesting, like, how do you compose, your romance in that world? Is there anybody who would like to go first? And I will go round, make sure you will get time. Yeah. Thank you, Liz.
I think it's fun because it's a whole different world. So there can be different like sets of rules and norms for relationships and romance. There's probably different like logistical things, like even weddings could be different. I think it's just fun because it's fantasy, it's speculative. It could be anything you want it to be, but we also want it to mirror and people be able to relate to, romance in the real world. The fantasy worlds are so much more fun. So I think because it's a fantasy, it's got a lot more possibilities.
Yeah. Can we talk about Jen Evans' Reign and Ruin and her Mages of the Wheel series and how the orgasms in there are magic based? I think this is a great question to go to her. Jen.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, before I get to the magic orgasms, I
there's a
think,
before.
right, really. I think the strength of fantasy is that it lets you look at the real world through a different lens, and you can take a problem or a situation and turn it around, turn it upside down, look at it from a different perspective in a way that you can't necessarily do in contemporary writing. And romance is the same way. And when you put romance into a fantasy setting, you can change the stakes. In a lot of fantasy romance, the stakes are world ending or changing. You're talking about rulers getting married or not and that sort of thing. So the stakes can be higher, which is always fun. But you can also explore things like gender or non-romantic love or LGBTQIA, sorry, I can't do it, the alphabet, through a lens. And sometimes it can make you more comfortable in exploring something you're not familiar with. It introduces a topic maybe that is a little bit fraught in just a normal setting. It allows people to come at that from a different point of view. And as for writing magical orgasms, I don't know. When I write magic, I imagine it as something that permeates all parts of your life. And so in these particular books, yes, it does have a role in my open door sex scenes.
Which are so good. Really good.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's it's funny as well, because I feel like I started off on a reading curve, or I started off with the ones that didn't actually have very much kind of, they didn't have very much of the banging in them, and as I've read, I've got on the escalation of, like all of them have had good looking people with lots of muscles and lots of torsos and all this kind of stuff, and but yeah, the sort of level of sex has gone up incrementally.
Was that
with each
by
one.
design, or coincidence? Like,
It
did
was
you define it?
coincidence.
Oh,
A
awesome.
complete coincidence. When I was talking to the promotions team last week, I actually said there hasn't been very much banging in what I've read so far, and then I sent a message to Meg McDonald that said, "And the banging has arrived."
It's like doing a flight of wine from white to red. You know, you just.
I think. I mean, for me though, it's sort of. It gives you that plethora of, you know, romance is a complicated and big genre, and you can get from one to the other, and you know, yeah, so I just thought it was really sort of fascinating. But Jen, you go in a completely kind of different direction with, sorry, I got the wrong person, Becky. I was looking at doesn't help. Looking at you doesn't help. But Becky, you go in a really different direction with the King's Swordsman. Can you just kind of explain in that series how you kind of put your relationships together?
Yes, explain your reasoning. Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to explore, yes. So, you know, Lev is one of those driving forces throughout humanity and human history and what have you. And I think there was a book written, you know, the 7 plots of every novel. You know, there's only 7 basic plots, and it all ends with people falling in love because you've got the male and the female coming together and what have you. And I was like, interesting. And is that really completion? Like, you know, is that the sort of the goal of the story? Is that reconciliation and that finding your other half, whoever that might be, and there's only ever 2, and started to explore that from all right, what if that person was a platonic thing, and actually they are meant to complement you, and what if you shared emotions across a bond and it wasn't a romantic type of thing, it was meant to make you know, by exploring that's been lots of fun, because then of course you can have romantic relationships with other pairs and you know, and the love just goes on and on and on. So yeah, so that's my reasoning for that.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting for me reading it as well, because soul bonded people is quite a common trope in fantasy literature, but I've never seen it put together like that. It's often a very sort of, oh, they're my soulmate, and that immediately means sexual pairing. Or it's just kind of this sort of, yes, they are, and we're bonded for life and we'll never be apart, we're sworn to each other. But I think, could you just explain how it, I mean, it gets very complicated, but could you just explain the sort of basic elements?
How it works. Yeah.
Yes.
So like, nobody understands on Oberot, no one understands why or how this has happened, but spirits are split at birth, and you've got the 2 sides, and once they find each other, they realize that they are meant to be the complement of the other person, or at least that's what they explain it at the moment, because as I said, no one really knows for sure. And so you've got two people who are living very separate lives, and the longer they go without meeting each other, the more unbalanced they are. So one will be, you know, pure happiness, and the other one will be sadness, and one will be like, you know, confidence, the other one will not be. And so you've got all these extremes going on. So it's when they finally meet, and you have that very much like yin and yang sort of pairing. Which made for some really interesting fireworks, but at the same time, they complement each other and they help each other, and they both got strengths. It's not as if one character has all the strengths, although he thinks he does. There's other softer strengths that he hasn't appreciated before, and so this was the opportunity to say, hey, you can be a shy, timid, super depressed type of person and still have value, and, you know, be the key thing to helping this high-flying star-studded individual to his goals. So yeah.
I really like the idea that you can kind of call and respond to people as well, that one person can call and the other person can respond, and he's particularly annoyed that he isn't the one that is what he considers to be the really strong version, that he's the opposite one, and when he finds out, he gets very, very sort of upset about it, but then
steps back in the chair, doesn't he? Just,
yes, yeah. I thought it was going to be, you know, again, I think you're right, and there's a lot of kind of, I think there's a lot of sort of subtextual discussion of, you know, what is masculinity in that as well. Like, you know, what does it mean? Because he's this sort of big beefy warrior who wants to rescue people and realizes that's not how real life works. Which,
no, strangely enough.
yeah. So Liz, you look quite a lot at, there's quite a lot of siblings in your writing, and again, particularly because obviously The Alchemist's Mirror was the one that I looked at. You've got siblings, and then you've kind of got hangers on. Again, how did you sort of position the different couples that you have in your and groups that you have?
Yeah, The Alchemist's Mirror is about two sisters whose brother's gone missing, and one of the sisters does end up at first hating and then becoming interested in another explorer character. But I come from kind of like a large family. I have 4 siblings. So family is always like a part of my characters' lives. And they're part of like, I try and make them part of like decision making occasionally. And my first series, I started off with saying, I don't want to have the main character whose parents are just dead like everyone else's. Every other YA character whose parents are dead. So I like to include family because they can help and hurt situations by being there. They can, much like a romantic partner, they can be like a weakness that someone needs to protect, or, you know, they steer them in the wrong direction, not on purpose, or maybe on purpose, I don't know. But yeah, in The Alchemist's Mirror, it does revolve around family, and I'm assuming you might have started with one of mine on that scale of banging, because as soon as you said that, I'm like, oh, I was on the low scale. Because I do write YA.
I tried to take the most recent thing that everybody had read, and then work back, so that, because everybody had read so much, that I was like, I read one from everybody and then I need to go on a little bit. So yeah, because I write YA leaning, and I do write a lot of younger characters. You know, one of my series starts off with a girl's 13, so I do a lot of like the first budding romance and things. So I do include a lot of like family members or found family and things like that. Yeah. And I think, I mean, again, found family goes through all of the writing that I read. It seems to be, I mean, even in I hesitate to call it mainstream, but a lot of romance at the moment seems to include a lot of found family. That seems to be a real kind of dominant trope that's starting to emerge. But Rachel, you probably know what I'm going to ask you. What does your mother think about the portrayal of the mother figure in your writing? Because your heroine is Jewish and she has a very Jewish American mother. And you have written, I think it's the second book, the dedication says, "To my mother, please don't read the sex scenes." How did you sort of negotiate writing such a character when there's a sort of clear reference to the fact that your mother is quite sort of inspirational there?
So I wrote maybe 8 or 9 chapters of Inked, and I called my mom and I said, listen, I think you're going to be mad at me. I really do. And I need you to know this is coming from a place of love. Like, there were so many like qualifiers. I was like, it comes from a place of love. I slightly exaggerated it, although I didn't really exaggerate it that much. It's mostly my mom. And I said, I'm going to email this to you, and you tell me how mad you are on a scale of 1 to 10. And she called me back like 30 minutes later, and I like had the phone, like out to here expecting the yelling. And there was yelling, but it's because she was howling with laughter. And she did yell at me because she said she peed a little bit. But that's her fault, not mine. That's, that's between her and her. Anyway, no, she loves it. She loves it. And she is such a big, fun personality. when I was writing Linked, the third book in the series, every book takes like the sexual tension and sexual content a little bit higher than the last. And I said, look, Mom, I'm going to send this, manuscript to you, but I really, really need you really to like skip past this chapter and this chapter. And she was like, I got you. What is it with this prude child I've raised? I'm like, what are you talking about, prude? I wrote them. And she was like, do you need to have a round with Luigi? And I'm like, don't you dare tell me who Luigi is. Don't you dare. And then, of course, she proceeded to tell me about her fancy Italian made vibrator, and maybe I need to be stuck being so pent up, and it was horrible. And anyway, my mom's a big fan, and sometimes I wish she was slightly less of a fan. And she reads every word of the sex scenes and then proceeds to torment me with them. That's my mom.
I think yeah, there's a wonderful moment where she's explaining something, and Talia is also talking to something about the sort of main hero character, and they're talking about the circumstances of her birth, and she says, I gave birth to her just normally, and then she says vaginally. this sort of like but it is very clear, like there are at least 2 points where people say, why are these two shouting at each other? And they're saying, well, that's how they say that they love each other. And I think
that's how Jewish people say I love you.
Yeah. And it felt, for me, it felt refreshing actually to just sort of see again. I think one of the things fantasy often does is it brings, as Jen, you said, it brings kind of what could be quite fraught topics into a space where you can actually explore them, and where it is loving and it is funny, rather than and again, you discuss aspects of the Holocaust and make comparisons with the Holocaust and the fairy realm, and that's a big deal. That's a sort of big thing, but contextualizing it within fantasy really kind of helps, and that's never something that's ever going to be softened.
No, I was actually talking to Jen about this too, just as like a quick aside, because this isn't romance based, but when the books first came out, I had a lot of Gentiles, non-Jewish people, not a lot, maybe 5 or 6 total, saying, I feel like this has harmful tropes about Jewish people, or I feel like there's some stereotypes, or like kind of doing that virtue signaling. And I did call them out, and I said, you know what, this aspect is for Jewish people, and this is not something you need to worry about. And the Jewish readers who are reading this are feeling seen, and that's really important, that representation there. And since then, actually, it's been really wonderful, and I've gotten a lot of messages, saying it's been really nice to see inside this culture through that fantasy lens. So it's been wonderful. It was nice to write about that.
Yeah. And I think I'd like to sort of move that over to Jen, actually, because again, you're engaging very much with a culture. There seems to be quite a lot of drawing from potentially Arab cultures. I'm kind of getting that.
Yeah, it's
you're looking at me like, no.
No, it's okay. It's fine. It's Turkish Ottoman, but
okay, thanks.
I spent some time in Lebanon and Jordan and the Levant, basically, and the geography there interested me, but also the culture is very interesting. And the background that I tell people is, in America, if I say Beirut, it conjures a really specific kind of a feeling and an image, and it's not a very positive one.
Yeah.
And the fact is that Beirut is a multifaceted city, and Lebanon has been part of every empire that's existed, and it's layers upon layers of culture and history, and it's a Mediterranean. It's beautiful. It's a Mediterranean place, and I did not want to tackle a religion that was not mine, so I did not base this off Islam, but I did base it off the geography and historical Ottoman sort of cultural things. You know, it's difficult to extract a culture from the religion that raised it, right? But that's where I tried to draw the line specifically.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very clear. I think that I have read things where it is not very clear, and that's not the case. And again, it's something that as fantasy writers, I wanted to just open that out more broadly, actually, because you do need to be careful of cultural appropriation. And I wonder, again, sort of Liz and Becky, whether this is something that you've kind of dealt with in any of the worlds that you've created as well.
So thinking of that, there's like old-fashioned tropes, I guess, of like, you know, the dangerous South or what have you, and like as in like, you know, the southern continents are dangerous, and I take that apart in book 3. Right. Where the culture there is actually, you know, a lot more, it's definitely been misunderstood. I guess a ton of my writing can be boiled down to culture shock. So seeing something for the first time, not understanding what it is, trying to parse it through your lenses. So the fantasy is great for that. And then to do it the other way around and see this is what a fantasy character thinks of Earth. That was pretty fun too. You got some funny fish out of water moments. But,
there's a fantastic description of what it's like to experience a television for the first time if you are a trained warrior. And I think the people around when that happens and he's hiding behind the sofa and there's some sort of gun battle going on the television and it's very frightening. Another mother comes in and laughs at him, and the heroine says, "Can you just don't, it's not funny, he's really frightened."
And like protects him from the telly.
But it does sort of break that moment, and again, this was the sort of the one that really got me. I live opposite a train line. It is literally outside my house, and there's some very funny descriptions of catching the train and having conversations on the train. How do you talk on the train? And the way that it's described is a sort of, you know, you mustn't talk very loudly, you mustn't talk about personal things, but people do. So there's all these sort of weird moments where that happens. Liz, is that anything that you've kind of dealt with in any of your writing?
Yeah, my Realm of Camellia series is Japanese inspired portal fantasy.
Okay.
So I came up with the inspiration for it when I was visiting Japan. The countryside, the cities, it's a really fascinating, beautiful place with a lot of history. And I based the kind of time period on Edo era, the samurai era, Japan. So I read a lot of like historical accounts from samurai and, you know, various other people, and about like Japanese fairy tales. And I mainly wanted to write about magic, and it's almost Avatar, The Last Airbender inspired magic system. So yeah, I'm wrapping up that series now. The 4th book is coming out pretty soon, and it's been really fun to learn about the culture and let's just kind of explore it and do my best to give it justice.
No, oh damn it! It's like there was too much to pick from. Now I'm like, okay, well, at least I know what's on the list yet. I'm reading through my TBR list at the moment as a sort of punishment, I guess. So I've managed to read 24 books this year, but they've all been stuff that's already on the Kindle or in my books on my bookshelves. So, but I think afterwards I'm just going to be like, the pile hasn't got any smaller, which is a bit alarming. So
no, they never do.
No, and I haven't added to it. It's just every time I go into another room, there's something on the floor, or there seems to be another bookcase, and I'm like, what's going on in this?
Titles just magically appear on there when you're not looking.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh god. Okay. Anyway, so my next big question is the second question I've written down. That's how far I've got through the list. So the second big question that I had was about blending tropes. We've sort of talked a little bit about some of the sort of individual things, but romance has got very, very specific tropes in it. You know, it's got enemies to lovers, or mind goes blank, just one bed, you know, and they're all called stuff like this. They've all got these sort of very specific names, and they kind of do what they say on the tin. Happily ever after is obviously the sort of very, you know, the concluding one, but fantasy does too. So how do you blend those together? Because you're, in some ways, you're building two worlds. You're building a fantasy world, but you're also building a place in which romance takes place. Does anyone want to take a stab at that one? Because it's fascinating, but
I can jump in.
Great.
So I think that, you know, I deal pretty specifically with romantic love. Mine's a pretty classic fantasy romance, you know, and it does tend to, mine splits the difference a little bit between a fantasy plot and a romance plot, but it is a romance book, right? So when I'm building a world and a story, typically I'm going to start with the couple. That's just what usually pops into my head, is like some premise for a love story. And then I'm a pantser. So a lot of that stuff comes as I write along, but I do have in my head this idea that the world has to contribute to interfering with this relationship in some way, right? It has to inhibit, create tension in the buildup of this relationship. And, you know, vice versa. It doesn't have to be enemies to lovers, right? Which is a really, really popular fantasy romance trope. But it does have to be impeded in some way by the magic or the setting, or, you know, something that's going on. And you know, it can be as simple as these people have other responsibilities and they don't have time for love. But so when you're building your fantasy plot, you have to build it kind of in the same steps that you build this romance, right? And so I focused a lot on, in my books, I focused a lot on this idea of balance. I was interested to hear Becky talking about that concept and how she executed it in hers, because it's another one that I really love to explore as well. And I went differently. I went very romantic with mine, but so the magic itself has these ideas of opposition and harmony, which feed very well into romantic relationships, you know? So I think it's just a matter of whether you're a pantser or a plotter, and that the beats in each arc need to kind of coincide, right?
Yeah, fab. Yeah, anybody else? Like,
I was just thinking, and building on what Jen said, that like I write character-driven stuff. So yeah, having the world interfere with the character in order to help them grow, sort of thing. And I am definitely a pantser as well. Like, I'm just writing up an incident report of what the swordsman is doing. I have no control over but yeah, so to have it then, there's always that wonderful sense of fulfillment at the end when like everything is resolved, but not necessarily happily ever after, but it is at least addressed, and having that balance and harmony at the end of the book gives that satisfying feeling. And I think that's common in both like sort of fantasy and romance books, that hopefully they're all nicely tied off.
Yeah, and the chat's given a couple of examples of both stuff that they like and other tropes, which are fake relationship, love triangles. There's some infamous versions of that one. Celebrity or royalty dating. I saw an amazing well, not saw, there's a really good episode of Smart Bitches Trashy Books, which is a fantastic romance podcast, in which they're brilliant, and they make predictions for, I believe it's 2018, which is obviously the year after the orange person got into power. And somebody says, I prophesy that there will not be any billionaire boyfriends in the next year or so. It's kind of nixed that idea a little bit. But there's forbidden love, there's arranged marriages, there's bodyguards, forced proximity, And then Teresa says, I really love Grumpy to Sunshine and fake dating. I really like fake dating, and I don't know why, because it seems such a sort of, I don't know, it seems so wrong. It's such a naughty thing. You know, I just finished reading whatever else I read a fake date a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, oh, this is really, really good, and don't know why I liked it so much. But yeah, Liz and Rachel, kind of any sort of, how do you integrate the two of them?
I think, fantasy is so great for taking those tropes and expanding them. And there's a cat.
Yes.
Hi, cat.
Pussy on the screen.
Sorry, that was very stereotypical. Oh, like a squirrel. So there's one of my all-time favorite scenes in my Gilded Blood series is Talia and her boss, who she finds out is an incubus. They're in the Fey realm. They have to share the tent. There's only one sleeping bag. So here we have the one bed trope, right? And in any contemporary fantasy, or I guess any fantasy at all, I mean, that's wonderful, right? Oh no, we got to the hotel. It's only one bed. Oops, guess we have to share it. Oops, I forgot my pajamas. Guess we have to sleep in there naked, right? Like, it's great. But add in the fantasy realm, right? Where you hear werewolves howling in the background, or finally you're about to give into your urges, and then you hear this like wet snuffling and snorting outside, and you find that it's a 12-foot tall fakan coming in to possibly eat you. I mean, like, it's so much fun to blend tropes in general, but add the fantastical element. And I mean, it's why it's my all-time favorite genre, is the romantic fantasy genre. I think that's a big part why.
Yeah, I was horrified in that scene because she was cold already, and then she took half her clothes off. I was like, what are you doing? There's werewolves outside.
It's a sleeping bag. When you're naked, it helps you warm up faster, and it makes a hot pocket, obviously.
Well, obviously, yeah.
These are facts.
Yeah. Like
especially in romance books.
My outrage didn't last a very long, don't worry.
Yeah, until the fakan came. Sorry about that. They're gross. Pecans are gross.
I'm sorry, I just keep hearing pecan. Like
pecan. Yeah, I know we're not supposed to body shame. We love all bodies. But when you have a creature whose head directly turns into a leg, and it's one leg, and it's got one arm and one eye, I mean, I think we can body shame that a little bit, especially if they're chasing after you with like a spiked bat,
Absolutely.
Nice. Yeah.
I'm getting the pecan nut. Though.
Much scarier
than
a sentient nut.
Sorry, future plot idea, sentient nut.
Yes, write it down. Pure gold right here.
We're co-writing it. Everyone watch out. 2024, sentient nuts are coming to you. Written by a sentient nut.
Okay.
I am like also a fan of the one bed trope. I don't have any in my books just yet, but I think it kind of brings back to an earlier point on a different question, that being in a fantasy realm, you have a lot of room to play, so you can meld tropes. And I am a plantser, so I plan a little bit and I pants the rest. So I do just kind of like meld things together. And that's, I think, a really good thing about fantasy, is we have a lot of room to play.
And I think I think, as you sort of said, there is this kind of, it feels new as well. You can put it in a different place. You can put it outdoors, or it can be a tent, or that there is quite a lot of, or again, there's culture shock, so the things characters are doing is slightly different, or there's the political marriage, I think, feels much more realistic in a fantasy world. I do quite like, I love Alyssa Cole's Reluctant Royal series. It's fantastic.
Yeah, they're fun. They
are very, very fun. And again, reading recommendation, everybody. Especially the one about escape rooms. I teach games up at the university, so I do feel like there's sort of, the royals kind of get to me. It's like, I decided a while ago that I was only going to read as many books about dukes as there were actual dukes in the UK. There's 34. So there's quite a lot of books to read. But at that point, we'll just have to hope there's some more. But yeah, it's just, I don't know, they're not, real life dukes aren't very sexy at all, unfortunately. But in a fantasy world, they absolutely are, and you can also kind of, and you can play around with power relationships and gender a lot more, I think, in the fantasy world, because, it's your choice whether there's a patriarchy. And that's really, which one do I want? I'm looking at time. I think we've covered that one. So how do you, this is a more general romance question, but again, I think it's got specific aspects that deal with fantasy writing. How do you make your main characters sympathetic?
I don't.
Well, it might open up a can of worms, which I'll try not to open, because it's something I feel strongly about. But one great way to make your characters sympathetic is to give them real flaws, put chinks in the armor, and give them room to grow, either as an individual or especially in romance. You want to see them grow together and hopefully make one another better. Not even in romance, right? Just in loving relationships. You want to have that room for growth, because if you start off with two perfect people, where do you go from there? But then, and this is a thing that I maybe don't want to talk about because I could talk about it for hours and hours, is when you have a female character with flaws, she tends to then get skewered.
Yeah.
Especially in romance, where I think that there's a lot of envy of the female characters who get to live these really cool lives and have like sexy boyfriends who like wait on them hand and foot, right? You read these books for, I think, escapism a little bit. So when you read about a female character who annoys you, you're like, you don't deserve that sexy vampire. I don't like the flaws that you have. And then that opens up a little bit more of a problem in romance writing in particular, I think. But the short answer is flawed characters help a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely like to build on that. I was gonna say before you continued about making mistakes, because that's what the criticism usually comes from, the female characters.
Yeah,
making mistakes makes them look like real people, but I think maybe sometimes people don't want to read about like super real people, but I think the realer they are, the more sympathetic we can be to them, whether we are or not. Whether that speaks to people is one thing, but the mistakes make us human, or fairy, or orc.
yeah.
It humanizes or organizes us, because no one is flawless, except maybe the love interest. Just kidding.
Wow.
Hey, I just finished reading the Air Awakened series by Elise Kova, and it starts off with the main love interest being very enemies, evil to the main character, so nobody's perfect.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think mistakes really give the characters, like, it makes them well-rounded, and you're not going to sympathize with like a 2D person, you're going to sympathize with a 3D person. So
so I think a mistake that new writers make when they're designing a flaw in a character, right, to make them relatable, is they go too surface level. Maybe it's a visible, the very classic, no offense to anybody, everybody take a deep breath, YA, she's got a scar on her face, right? That's not a flaw, okay? That's not a character flaw.
No.
That is an aesthetic choice.
Yeah.
A character flaw is in craft defined as the lie that somebody believes about themselves or the world, and then the actions they take in basically living up to that lie, right? So that sounds really vague, but that can present itself in a variety of ways. It can be they're, fish out of water, like in Rachel's case, which is what Talia is. And I do think Talia gets a lot of the kind of flack that Rachel's talking about, because she is a fish out of water. She is a person that has been transported to a magical realm. And some people find it offensive that she makes mistakes, which is silly, right?
Yeah.
I have a character that goes in the other direction. So in my third book, the character is she's a really strong female character in my mind. She's very much like femme fatale, and she's very like sexually comfortable, and just a really confident person. However, she has some trauma, bad trauma, and what I get is like, oh, she just thought about her trauma through this whole book. She should have gotten over it. She should have processed it. It just took too long for her to get over it. And tell me you've never had trauma without saying you've never had trauma. So there's a big spectrum of, she makes mistakes and she's too stupid to live, which is what Rachel's talking about, to the way you get into that Mary Sue kind of thing. There's, those are all flaws that work. It's just the reader perception is going to change. But as long as that person is living with this particular lie in their head, and that, that's a craft thing that you it would take hours to talk through, but then that's a good flaw. A good flaw is not that, their right thumb doesn't work and so they can't write their manuscript. That's not.
Yeah, I know
that's not a flaw.
Isn't it so great too when the love interest gets to call them out in whatever way that happens on that flaw, whether it's an actual confrontation or like gentle helping them move past it. But like, that's such a great thing about romances, is how the two kind of call one another out and say,
you would ideally have these flaws that are on, the opposite end of the spectrum in these two people, where they see and begin to realize what's happening, in their own head, and where they're wrong and where that lie lives.
Balance. Balance, yes.
Balance, yay!
We love balance.
I mean, I think there's two things there. The first one is, one of my least favorite flaws is she's clumsy. Again, that's not a flaw.
Yeah.
That's just a thing. And it doesn't make you, it's often used as this kind of, it's the sort of modern day kind of fainting heroine thing, and I think, again, not as much of a thing anymore, but it's something that I've noticed in all of your books that is always resolved very sensibly, is communication. Early romances were often very much, there'll be a misunderstanding that happens at, let's say, 30% of the way in, and it's not resolved until it will be a crisis at 80%, and it'll be resolved at 90. And
it would have taken one sentence, one sentence from an adult person to, that is Rachel's is too stupid to live. Mine is that. Don't get me started. I don't like it.
Sorry.
Oh no.
You're all sitting back. You've all moved backwards from the camera.
I think that's why a lot of people claim not to like romance, is because the early romance, I think, in a lot of mainstream was, oh, we had this misunderstanding and it would be so easy to fix, but we're going to give each other the silent treatment or do something else that's toxic. Like, who wants to watch that? Like, it's bad. So I'm so glad for like nouveau fantasy writers who are like, screw that. We're not going to do that anymore. People have cell phones now. You can use them.
Yeah.
I am going to defend the misunderstanding trope a little bit, because I do have one of my novellas does have misunderstanding in it. I wanted to have the characters have a history together and to like heal it. So they didn't have cell phones, but they did have two inventors' workshops right next to each other, and they were forced proximity to solve a problem. So I will defend it a little bit, but
yeah, I think that's actually slightly different, because it is also that again, that's a trope of there was an argument, they separated, and now they're back together again, and there's going to be some kind of some reason that they get back together. I can't. I've read a bunch of there's a whole rash of witches in America romances at the moment, and they're all called things like Payback's a Witch, or they're all really, again,
which
because
is adorable. I love that.
a good romance has to have a good pun, and I can't remember which one it is. One of them begins with she got really fed up with him because he was a complete twit, and she cursed him, and he's been cursed for about 15 years. And that's a really, I thought that was a really, really clever one, but I genuinely can't remember which one it was. What I'd like to do is, if there are any questions, there is a question from quite a lot earlier, and there's lots of recommendations going on. So the first, if you've got questions, if you could type them into the chat, that would be amazing, and I can pick them up. And I might not pick up all of them, but so so somebody asked if JD's hair was painted the colours.
Yeah, I saw that. Not on purpose, but it just worked out really well.
It's a good coincidence. Mine aren't. And Teresa asked right at the beginning, you've obviously all got people that kind of follow along with your characters quite a lot. And I will explain what this is. But do readers ship your characters? And for those of you who don't know, shipping is usually putting together two characters who aren't in a pair in a romantic relationship and then writing about it as fan writing. I think, unless anybody has a sort of wants to add to that, I think that's it. It's sort of basics. But do your characters get shipped?
Talia and the bad guy gets shipped sometimes.
Okay.
After the second book in the series, there's a mob boss who's an incubus. He's terrible. But he's also very sexy. And so they will sometimes get shipped. And I did get some fan art that was extremely naughty. Like there were genitals. There were genitals. I really wanted to post on Facebook, but I also didn't want my account to be shut down.
Yeah. There's no fun if you just put a bar over it. So.
No. All or nothing.
Gosh. He reminds me of Kenneth Irons from Witchblade. That's a very
I can see that.
I've just reread it, so because it was in the TBR pile, and God, the writing is dreadful. All these years later, I was like, this is this pioneering, bizarrely feminist comic with a romance plot in it, and it's badly written, but never mind, it's still fun. Has anybody else had any of your characters put together, or are there any that you would love to put together in a ship?
I do. I have a lot of side characters that people are always mixing and matching.
Cool.
What's your favorite?
Oh, everybody wants Samira and Tarek, which are like in Reign and Ruin. They're like the sidekick to my two main characters. They're the sidekicks, so everybody wants that. Yeah,
and they're very much kind of the support, the strong supporter.
The best friend. They each have their best friend.
There's also the sort of steadfast warrior and clever advisor coming in there as well with them. So yeah, I can totally see that. Like Samira makes me smile. It's fun. She's lots of fun. So okay. Let's have a look. Let's scroll down. My question into a queue. So I will ask you for recommendations afterwards. Have a think of any book recommendations that you've also got. And somebody's very helpfully typed your names into the chat as well. So Marion asks, can romance be successfully mixed with another genre? I was writing a political historical drama that included a romance. Oh no, my workshop told me that the book had to end with the marriage of the two protagonists. But
it depends on how you're marketing it.
Yeah,
it does. If you are going to market it as a romance, if you want romance readers to read it and not attack you with pitchforks, it has to have a happily ever after or a happy for now. It doesn't have to be marriage, but it has to indicate that those two people are together for the foreseeable future. If you are not going to market it as a romance, if you are going to market it as a historical fiction, no, you do not have to do that. They don't have that expectation. But the happily ever after, happy for now in romance is the same as the mystery in cozy mystery. There would be no cozy mystery without a mystery. There's no romance without happily ever after. So you have to decide how you're going to market that book. Most books have a romance subplot. So no, you don't have to worry about, oh God, this has never been done before. It has. You just have to decide how you want to market it. But they will. If you market it as a romance and your characters do not end up together, or you kill somebody, they might burn your house down. I don't know. You just never know.
Yeah.
Teresa has identified the book that I was describing, and it is, of course, the X-Hex, which is another good
X-Hex.
one.
I've seen that one floating around.
By
Yeah,
Erin
yeah.
Sterling. I recommend that
That
series.
is so cute.
The heroes are all
really
Welsh
cute.
as well. They're all just randomly Welsh.
Fantastic.
Yeah, does anybody else have any sort of thoughts about mixing genre like that, and sort of other ways that you can do that?
I think the branding or the genreing of it is what's important. One of the biggest romances that's my favorite is Outlander, and that's a lot of genres.
Yes.
I like to think of it as like historical fantasy romance because it's very historical, it's very political, but it's also very sexy, and there's time travel. So it's got a lot of genres, but I think the way they must have originally marketed it, it hit all the right, check marks, check boxes, whatever you want to say. And it works. All those different little subgenres tied in together, they work, considering how popular it is.
Yeah.
And you never know what's going to work until you try it. There's never any harm in giving it a go.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, I think that's true as well. I think also if you are that kind of writer, follow your nose when you're writing. Find out what happens, because yes, a happy ever after and happy for now is useful, but it may be that it just moves it into a slightly different genre. There's a lot of fiction out there. There's a lot of fiction out there. Whole bookshops of it. So Saskia asks, do you have any advice for a writer who doesn't normally write romance, who's just realized that their next book will have a romantic subplot? So this is, how do you write romance into subplots? And specifically, they're writing about forbidden love. But yeah, how, again, how do you sort of put it in on the side?
I think, like Jen said earlier, pretty much all stories have a romantic subplot. I mean, that's the difference between romance and everything else, right? In romance, the romance is the plot, or at least a very big driving force of the plot. And everything else, it's just love. I mean, we were all brought here through some sort of relationship. Hopefully there was romance involved, right? So, I mean, I can't think of any great story out there that didn't have some aspect of romance or love in it.
You just have to remember that a romance subplot is the same as any other subplot. If it is not creating tension, if it is not inducing character growth, if it is not contributing to the overarching plot in some way, then you don't need it. And there's no reason to put it in there. And so when you do put it in, or if you want to put it in, then you just need to make sure that it's structured in a way that is accomplishing one or all of those things: character development, tension, or plot arc development, right? So it helps always to read in the genre that you're trying to write. So if you want a subplot, either read stuff with strong subplots or just read straight romance,
I'm going to argue with you directly, though, Jen, in that you're wrong, in that porn doesn't really need it to drive the plot. You know what I mean? So I feel like maybe you're leading this person askew, because pornography It doesn't need to.
Well,
do
then we're writing
anything for the
erotica,
plot.
and it is no longer a subplot.
And of course, I'm just being snarky and facetious. Everything you said is like spot on. Random penises.
You know, I mean, well, I think there is a, particularly if you're coming from like the hardcore epic fantasy, hardcore science fiction, and you see maybe as a writer, wow, those romance writers are really popular. Wow, they sell a lot of books. Romance sells. You know, I got to add this in. You have to be careful because the romance doesn't sell it. Well-written romance that hits the tropes and expectations of its genre sell it. So you can't just throw glitter into your book and expect that it's then going to be a bestseller. It still has to function the same way that any other plot that you add into your book would. And if it's a romance that you plan to market to romance readers, then you have to hit the expectations of the genre, just like you would in fantasy.
It's funny, you're kind of talking about it like a tokenization of love, right? Like there are people who just want to throw things into their story just to say that they have it.
Right.
Yeah, I had an author who wanted to put Jewish people in his story in the form of dwarves with big noses, and he wanted me to explain Jewishness to him. And I was like, cool, we should not do this.
Yeah.
Thing. If you're just throwing it in there to throw it in there, then just creating a token of something.
Basically, I mean, slightly less racist and offensive, but still not helpful to your ultimate goal is just to throw in that romantic subplot, right?
Yeah.
I think, like Jen said, as long as it's contributing to the plot or tension, it does make it more. I mean, it's not required, but I think it does help round out some characters because love exists everywhere. And, you know, if you follow a character for a particular amount of time, like years and years, like it's highly likely that they'll stumble across some romance. And, but I think it does need to be tied to the plot. And that's what makes it.
Yeah. And feeds into the plot, and then the plot feeds into the romance and feeds back again, and it all just weaves together beautifully.
Yeah. And I think one of the strengths of romance or romance subplots is it really allows you to dig into the vulnerability of a character, because you are seldom more vulnerable than when your flaws and your weaknesses are open and revealed to another human being in whatever that capacity is, whether it's a found family or a romantic love or whatever. It's a really great way to explore more deeply into the psychology of that character. And I think that's what people miss out on when they're like, I'm going to throw love in here. And what I always argue is that romance is not actually, in fact, about the sex. It's about the journey and the internal growth of the character. And the sex is fun, you know, if that's your thing, but it still has to function as a plot. It still has to grow the character or reveal something about the character.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, that's a very, very good point. And I've got kind of personal experience of this because I share my audiobook account with a partner, and he just listens to all the stuff that's on there. So there's all sorts of things, you know, there's the whole Witcher series, which, good grief, I'll get to the end eventually one day, maybe. There's just sort of, you know, there's lots of random stuff, but there's also quite a lot of romance. And he started listening to some of it and actually said to me, I'm really enjoying these stories, like they're really in depth. They've got, you know, the people in them are really, really interesting. But he'd actually started listening because he started listening to, I think it was Talia Hibbert. Because the characters have neurodiverse, they're presented as neurodiverse characters, and he was particularly interested in, I think it's the third or the fourth book, where the character has ADHD and goes through a sort of process of being diagnosed, which was obviously directly relevant to what they were experiencing. And it sort of came back to me afterwards and said, oh, these books are great, I'm really, really enjoying them. And I was like, oh yeah, they're romance books, you know. And he was like, oh yeah, oh gosh, yes, I'd never made that connection. But he did also then get a little bit pissed off because he said that every time there was a sex scene, he was standing at work by the photocopier.
Yeah.
And it was the sort of, it was honestly,
yeah, it's always when
inappropriate. I mean, I've certainly been on the train where, you know, I've been on the train minding my own business, doing my knitting, and suddenly a really graphic sex scene comes on.
Right, and you feel like it's broadcast in neon across your forehead, and everybody can see it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just reading Rachel's last book at the gym. I had a paperback, and I'm standing on the treadmill, and I'm like, "Well, it's the beginning of the book. Like, okay." And then I'm looking at it, oh my God, like, does everyone know?
I know they can see.
Everyone knows. Everyone.
Yeah,
Everyone.
run faster. No one will notice.
So
it does help to run a treadmill. You're already red and panting.
There you go. Yeah.
Right? As long as your hand isn't down your pants, I'm sure you're fine. Once that happens, people probably know what you're listening to. But you know.
Yeah, exactly. So I did want to. I saw Saskia. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Had kind of a follow-up thing about the subplot does fit in with her main theme, but the sex would be the tricky part to write because it's out of her comfort zone, and lots of people are uncomfortable with sex. So I would argue, or say, argue maybe is a strong word. There's two things to consider when you're writing a sex scene. If you are really uncomfortable writing a sex scene, it is going to show, and it's not going to be very fun to read. So consider that when you consider putting sex into your book, right? And that is the other thing is when you decide whether you're putting open door sex into your book, you have to lead up to it with the amount that's promised in that subplot. It's just like violence, right? You don't pay off a really gory book with they had a fight and then we won against the evil wizard, right? You got to describe it in detail, and the sex is the same way. If you build to it in a closed door kind of way, you don't need to write sex. And again, you don't need sex to have the tension of a romantic subplot. You do not need it. I like to read it, but that doesn't mean you need it, right? And then the other thing is most people will say that when you're writing sex, it's much more about the reactions, the emotions, the feelings. It is not about anatomically correct exercise programs, right? You don't need to describe body parts going into other body parts or whatever is happening in that. You know, you don't need to do that to have a consummation. So there's plenty of stuff on that though. So if that's where you're going, there's plenty of stuff on the craft of writing sex scenes out there.
Oh yeah,
definitely go with.
There's a whole chili pepper scale for it.
Yeah, we love our chili peppers.
Becky, what were you just saying?
Building on Jen saying that it's the feelings that you want to draw out, not necessarily what I call the wet noises.
Yeah, exactly. Oh God. Rachel's like
a pause.
And for God's sake, never write moist. Never use that word. Nobody wants it. Immediately they'll close the book and move on.
Someone asked me the difference between steam and smut. Well, she asked me if there was smut in my books, and I said no, because nothing quivers and there are no throbbing members. So there you have it, the difference between smut and steam.
Yeah, it's interesting too, though. Like romance readers and writers have adopted smut as like their flag. It is their flag. However, it's like coming from the outside, it's often derogatory, but if you're talking about it on the inside of romance, it's like a affirmation. It's been an interesting evolution of the word, because I grew up in a time where if you said smut, it was not a nice thing to say. You know, it was base level, poor writing, only there for titillation kind of thing. But within the romance community, they love it.
Yeah. Is smut, I'm curious, like Liz, Becky, Esther, I don't even fully know what smut is. Is it just like the literary romance version of porn? Like, I don't know what smut means anymore.
It's changing. I'd argue that it's changing. Yeah, it doesn't mean what it used to mean. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think within a fantasy and science fiction world, which is sort of where we're talking from as well, it feels like there are so many sort of layers to what's being said here, because it's like, so we did, this wasn't me, this was one of the people on my team did a panel at Dublin where she took the back jackets of romance fantasy literature and she wrote real ones. She had some real ones and she had some fake ones. And the panelists had to describe what the story was going to be. So it wasn't a which one's real and which one's fake, let's all laugh at what these descriptions are. It was very much like, again, smart bitches do cover snark, where, you know, they were sort of looking at these back things and saying, you know, what's going to happen in these stories. And I think when you're looking at stuff within science fiction, you know, I'm very bored of people saying I don't really like science fiction. I'm like, okay, that's fine. I don't really, as a video game scholar, people will come up to me, I'll give a paper or a lecture and people will begin their question with, I don't really know very much about games, and it's like,
but I have opinions. Yes, I do.
Great. Okay. Well, I've just talked to you for an hour, so what an odd beginning to it for a question. Yeah. And I wonder if kind of smart is kind of in that as well. It's that sort of, yes, it's derogatory on the outside, not necessarily on the inside, but it's also that sort of, there's not very much there because there's so much more behind it, you know. And like, I think,
yeah,
you know, I know that we do quite a lot of panels and we do quite a lot of stuff with romance, and I'm really looking forward to this coming EasterCon because T. Kingfisher, Ursula Vernon is going to be our guest of honor, and I'm hopefully going to be on a panel with them.
That'd be amazing.
But I think, oh God, I'm really excited. It's hot paladins everywhere. It's going amazing. But I do sort of wonder if it's a word that's just, it's gone off.
Yeah, I think it within the romance and romance subgenres, it's used more broadly to refer to things with spicy scenes, with scenes that are open door. So typically, if you're saying smut, you're not talking about a closed door book. You're not talking about a YA book. You're talking about a book with an open door sex scene. Outside, I think it still derogatorily means this book is not good because they fall back on this sex as a filler for plotting kind of thing.
Yep.
That's my assumption. I may be totally wrong. Like, that's how I've been interpreting it. Yeah.
I think that works. So yeah. Okay, so we've had our 10-minute warning. And somebody's also asked for my name. I don't know, are they taking names? Am I going to get horrible emails tomorrow? I don't know. It might be, it's above my head. So as we finish up, do you have any reading recommendations? There have been lots and lots and lots in the chat, but is there anything else that you are publishing, obviously, that we should know about? And is there anything else that you recommend that people should go off and read?
I have so many. I'll wait.
You start.
I'll wait.
No, you start, Rachel.
Specifically romance, right?
Yeah, fancy romance. Well, yeah, romance. Yeah.
I really genuinely, I'm not just saying this, I really like the way Jen does her romance and sex in her books. It's very respectful, and there's like an emotional quotient there, which I just think is so important. And I just think it's so well done. So definitely pick up her Mages of the Wheel series. I have heard phenomenal things about Becky and Liz. I'm just gonna say that I like their books, are so freaking good. I read Becky's first 2 books and they're phenomenal. I need to read your 3rd one, Becky. Can I get an arc? Really enjoy Annette Marie. If you like fast-paced urban fantasy, she is definitely a rising star. I have a bunch more. I'll write them down though. You guys, you can interject.
I think my most recent fantasy romance read that I really enjoyed was Fate of Wrath and Flame by K.A. Tucker. It's the first in, I think, a trilogy. I do believe the 2nd book is out. I don't think the 3rd book is out yet. I love really big plots, like God plots and just big things like that. And she has that going on, and she does a really good job. That's a big assumption that it's a she. I apologize. But in the book, things are not as they seem. And I've read enough and I've written enough that it's actually really hard to get one over on me. I'm not bragging. I feel like every writer can say that. It's really hard to get twists and stuff because you just know the craft, right? And these books I feel like are going there, and I love that. I love a good twist that gets me, right? So that's my one. And then if you haven't read, I am going to plug Rachel's because I've also read them recently, and they are what I love about Rachel is twofold. One, the humor is top notch. It is absolutely my kind of humor. I laughed out loud all the time. Yep. And also her magic systems are so creative and kind of sciencey, and I'm a huge science nerd, and so they absolutely scratch that itch. So you got to check them out. And probably the prettiest covers ever. All the colors. They sort of channel the Lisa Frank vibe from my youth.
Oh my God, that is such a compliment. Thank you. I would cover my body in Lisa Frank if I could. Thanks, Jen.
Lisa Frank.
There are also line drawings at the beginning of every chapter, which are
and they're beautiful. Yeah, and Rachel does those, by the way.
They're highlighted. The ones in the Gilded Series are highlighted so that they look like tattoos, even though
they're very pretty. Yeah, I agree.
So Becky, I saw you reaching for something.
I've got shows and tells, yeah. So I would definitely recommend Allegra Pescatore.
Yes, that's been on my TBR forever.
Really cool. Absolutely like sweeping fantasy, and it covers all, if you want to talk about genre bending, this is definitely it, and just done in such a really good way, and character driven again. So I really love that sort of stuff. In terms of like this book will break you. It's by Alice Virginia. It is The Widow and the Beast, and it's teeny tiny, and it will absolutely like crush you. And she's a fantastic writer as well. I really enjoyed this
as I'm typing them in chat, but I didn't see the author.
Thank you.
Widow and the Beast by Alice Virginia.
Okay, Alice.
Cool.
I've heard wonderful things about Alice. I've heard that her books are very
very good. Yeah, very good. I also really enjoyed this one. So this is by Casey Lee and Raven Storm, and the series is Rise of the Alpha. It's got really cool names like Changed, and something else. Maybe. And it's sort of, it looks like your typical werewolf book, right? And she does something really interesting with it, because they're both alphas, and so that whole dynamic between male and female and power and all that sort of stuff, and I thought that was really, really clever. And I have read a book by Liz Delton, The All Hallows Airship, and I really enjoyed it. So
yes. It was a toss-up, actually.
And of course, I second a recommendation for Rachel's book, but I'd also like to throw in there that Jen's book was SFBO winner last year.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
So
that's actually super notable. No romance book has ever won that before. It has always just, and not even like light fantasy or urban fantasy, it's always just been dark, gritty, epic fantasy. And Jen's win was like, it kind of blew us away, because nobody expected a romantic fantasy book to win, and it was just so well written. They were like, well, here we go. It was awesome.
So 10 out of 10, many people recommend.
Thank you. I'm extremely uncomfortable now. Over to you, Liz.
Making more uncomfortable.
Well deserved.
I have like a light, a cozy romance recommendation, because it was one of my top favorite of last year, Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry. Yes. It's a sapphic romance between the main character, who's an orc, Viv. It's just cozy fantasy is my jam now for reading. It's just, I'll read it like between like the world ending books, but it's just a nice change. And I'm glad everyone has pimped Rachel's book because, you know, it deserves pimping. So in the good way. And then one of my other top favorite urban fantasy series that has like a pretty heavy romantic subplot. It's like maybe half the plot. So I don't know if that's sub or not, but it's Kim Harrison's The Hollows series. And it recently got revamped. Like it had originally ended, and she's been coming out with I can't reach it. It's so close. She's been coming out with like I think 2 or 3 more. And just the main character, Rachel Morgan, is such a badass, and her relationships are really fun to explore. So
brilliant. Cool. Thank you. I've tried to type those into chat, so I hope everybody has grabbed them. And we've run out of time. So I'm really sorry. But I just want to spend, oh my goodness, the last 60 seconds just saying thank you to everybody. Sorry, that was a very abrupt stop. What a shame. But that was absolutely brilliant. I knew it was going to be fun, but it was fun. And I hope people really, really enjoyed it. And I really, really do encourage you to go and pick up everybody's books and do what I did, read them one after the other so that you can just get a feel for such a different collective of writers, you know, writing about the same thing. It was a really nice thing to have done in the last week and a half or so. Like really, really enjoyed that. And I'm hoping I will see everybody at Worldcon, obviously. Please go off and get your memberships and get yourself sorted, and maybe some of you at EasterCon as well. But thank you very much. So yes, thank you to Liz, Rachel, Becky and Jen for a really, really wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Thanks, everyone.
Hooray. So I think the streaming just stops, but we could I don't really know what happened.